Hello again. It is now 1:01, so time to start our webinar, Mobility from Poverty Metrics. This is an opportunity for us to explain a little bit about the work that we've been doing on these metrics, and also, most importantly, to get feedback from everybody on the use and value of these metrics. Before we get into it, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Urban website along with a PDF copy of the slides after the webinar. Give us a couple of days, but it will be up there. Currently, all participants are muted. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the question box. We have people monitoring that, so if you experience any difficulties or have any thoughts that you'd like to share, please do that. And then also, most importantly, at the end of the webinar, we'll have some time left over for questions and answers. Please share your questions, thoughts, comments, feedback then as well. Throughout the webinar, there will be targeted poll questions that appear. I believe there are 7 of them total, giving you an opportunity to provide some specific feedback on the mobility metrics and how they could be used. And so now I'd just like to quickly introduce myself. The voice that you are hearing is Brian Beards. I am a policy associate here at the Urban Institute. And then I will turn it over to my colleagues, Marge and Joe, to introduce themselves.
I'm Marge Turner. I'm Senior Vice President for Program Planning and Management here at the Urban Institute. And thanks for joining us.
And Joe?
And Joe Schilling, a Senior Research Associate at the Urban Institute in the Research to Action Lab.
Great.
And I'm just going to say a little bit about the Urban Institute in case you don't know about us. We are a nonprofit research organization based here in DC, and we're convinced that when policy decisions and on-the-ground practice decisions are shaped by facts rather than guesses or ideology, they really have the power to improve policy and practice, to strengthen communities, and to improve people's lives. We have experts at Urban building knowledge, assembling data, conducting evaluations across a huge range of social and economic policy domains. Just across our 12 research centers, which are shown here, we have experts focused on such areas as children, adolescents, youth, and families, retirement and aging, crime and justice policy, education, pre-K through post-secondary and workforce development, health and health policy, tax policy, housing and neighborhoods, poverty, and the safety net. This breadth of sort of expertise and interest has really convinced us of the importance and the power of a focus on upward mobility for people experiencing poverty or people struggling to climb the economic ladder. And the project that we're going to be talking about today and getting your feedback on is really an attempt to equip local decision makers with a set of metrics they can use to assess their community's progress over time as a place that boosts residents' upward mobility. And that really draws on the experience across all our domains of work. And again, we're really looking forward to your input today.
And then, so just a quick agenda for today's webinar. We'll talk a little bit about the background on the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, talk a little bit about the mobility metrics themselves, provide you an overview, and then we'll launch into some thoughts on how the mobility metrics could be used in your community. So some different ways that you could use it to collect data, to compare your community to other communities, really just to generate some conversation about the use of the metrics. And then we'll wrap up with some next steps, along with, as I said, a question and answer session. And our goals for today are really, as we've said, we've developed these metrics, but it's still sort of maybe about midway through the process. So it's an excellent opportunity really to get feedback on this set of concise metrics that are attempting to measure mobility from poverty. And so we want to hear from you, do these metrics resonate with you? Do they make sense to your community? Is there anything that's missing from these metrics? Are there ways that these metrics can be improved? And then also, as we've said, what could you or your organization or your community do with these metrics? How would you use them? And what could be done to make them more useful? And with that, we'll turn it over to Joe to talk a little bit about project background.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Marge. So this genesis for the current project, our Mobility Metrics Working Group, started with the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. So thanks to support again from the Gates Foundation in 2016, the Urban Institute was able to serve as sort of the coordinator and convener of really a diverse group of academics, practitioners, and thought leaders who were brought together to really answer a key question about what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty. And they did this by looking at the research, by practice, and actually going out into communities and talking to people who experience poverty firsthand to better understand the dimensions of this overarching question. And so from these conversations among themselves and with practitioners like yourselves, they came up with a robust and comprehensive definition of mobility that included not only economic success, as that's often the entry place that most of us start when we think about mobility from poverty, but on equal footing, the concepts of power, autonomy, and being valued in one's community to really provide a holistic view of mobility from poverty. Here's a slide of some of the individuals who were involved with the U.S. partnership. And again, it spanned the spectrum of those who were more conservative in terms of their approach and philosophy, to those who are more progressive, to different parts of the country and across different sectors. The U.S. partnership concluded its work roughly about a year and a half ago, but there's still a website that you can use for some of the resources, some of the working papers and discussions, and it provides really a good roadmap if you're just entering this concept of mobility from poverty. So let's go back to this overarching question. You know, what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? And as I alluded to, the definition that the U.S. partnership came up with was, yes, economic success is critical. Lots of research, lots of experience shows the different interventions of trying to increase, say, the wages of a family, or the income of a family. But what they thought is, even if you could increase family income by $1,000 a year, that in itself is not a guarantee that that family, and not only the current family, but generations down the road, would be able to move out of poverty. And so they also thought it was important to have power and autonomy connected to economic success. So a good example is you might have a new job and you're getting paid a living wage, and maybe you have some benefits, but you have little or no control over your hours. You have little or no control as to, you know, possible movement in that job to another position in that company or to another company, that you're pretty much sort of powerless in that current position. So even economic success might be okay, might be an improvement. Without power and autonomy, you're really not going to be able to move out of poverty. And then the next dimension was being valued in community. So, and of course we know there are lots of definitions of community, whether that's the community you live in, your professional community, the community of where you go to school. But it's important that someone be valued as a member of that community, be welcome in that community in order to really leverage the economic success, and it also leads to greater power and autonomy. So, yeah, go ahead.
I would just jump in here and highlight, I think, the fact that this three-part definition really reflects the fact that for many people experiencing poverty today, they don't just lack individual autonomy over their own lives, they lack power over the decisions, structures, systems that affect their lives. And many people are disrespected, devalued in their communities or excluded from communities. So this is a really powerful definition, I think, because it reflects both the individual scale aspects of mobility, but also the existence of really structural and systemic barriers that block people's progress out of poverty.
So that brings us to our first poll question. We'd like to hear from you about how much these principles for mobility from poverty resonate with you. So thinking about the three principles that we just laid out, sort of, does that make sense? Does that align with sort of your perspective and your thinking on mobility from poverty? And we'll take a few minutes. There's a fair number of people on the webinar. I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to weigh in. So we'll take maybe about a minute total for people to respond. And the responses are coming in. How much time do we've got? All right, let's take another 15 seconds. The last couple stragglers there. Close out your email, put that down for the time being. Give you another couple seconds. And great. So we're going to publish those. And that's excellent to see. The overwhelming majority of you agree or strongly agree that these mobility from poverty metrics, that they resonate with you and your work. There is a fair number, about 6%, that selected strongly disagree or disagree. And we'd love to hear from you. So we'll have a couple of opportunities for you to provide some feedback, sort of in what ways do they not resonate? You'll have some opportunities, and we'd love to hear from you. Also, everyone else, please feel free to provide additional feedback, as I said, through the chat function. Great, and then we'd like to also ask you a little bit more about the specific metrics, about the specific principles. So which mobility principles do you currently engage with in your work? And in this question, you can select up to three, all three, if all three of them are relevant. If only one of them is relevant to your work, select that one. Two, same thing. And we'll take about 45 seconds here to give everyone a chance to answer this question. All right, let's say maybe another 5 seconds. Our response is still coming in. Okay, well, that's great. We'd love to see a lot of responses. The more people respond, the more data points, better the data. And it looks like a couple of people are putting it in the chat window, which is great if you want to share some thoughts, but I'd also say go ahead and you should be able to click right on those boxes there and then hit submit. Okay, so I think we've leveled off now. We're going to go ahead and close the poll. Perhaps not surprisingly, economic success, which I think most people traditionally think of with mobility from poverty, 89% of you selected that. But it's great to see that about half also selected power and autonomy and being valued in your community as well. So that's great. We're going to go ahead and close the poll and turn it back over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Brian. And again, as the answers to the poll and some of the questions that have come in, this issue of mobility from poverty is complex. There are many, many facets to it, and some that we don't completely understand. But what evolved from the partnership was the current project, again, where we're trying to get your feedback, is in developing a set of concise metrics that communities can use to assess their progress on this important question over time. And so, again, with additional resources from the Gates Foundation, the Urban Institute convened a panel of 11 academic experts from across the country in the fields of, say, sociology, economics, political science, psychology, in order to look at the research, look at the evidence, to see how a concise group of metrics could evolve from that wide body of work that's out there. And so since the first part of the year, the working group has come together a few times to help design this mobility metrics. And what we heard from many of our colleagues is that it would be important to really go out and get some feedback, to really road test, to vet these metrics. So since September, we've had 3 road testing labs where we've been in New Orleans, San Francisco, and Cleveland just last week to convene essentially focus groups of practitioners who are service providers, local government officials, community foundation leaders, to spend a few hours with us digging deep into the research and the metrics and how this connects to their work and what would be useful for their work. And then we've done these 4 webinars. So again, webinars across different audiences. We've done some webinars with local government officials, National League of Cities, National Association of County Officials, this one and the next week with a network of community foundations. So part of the goal here, again, is to then take this feedback for when the working group will convene in just a few weeks to make some further enhancements of the work, as well as then our preliminary plan at this point is there's a research paper that will be released in some form in the first quarter of next year to help document the information and also the process of the working group. But I could talk more about the working group, but I also wanted Marge for you to elaborate a little bit. So Marge is wearing a number of hats, as she does so skillfully here at Urban. So she's been chairing the working group, and in many ways, Marge is the ideal chair, just given her breadth of experience with this issue and with the research, and being able to help us sort of translate what some of that research says and some of the expertise of the working group into action.
Thanks, Joe. It's been a really terrific process, and I've enjoyed it. As you can see now from this slide, we have a really distinguished group of scholars from across the country and across academic disciplines. All of them have thought hard about issues of mobility, and all of them have thought about all 3 of those dimensions of mobility that Joe described. But they bring really, different points of view and different academic evidence with them to the conversation. So integrating their experiences, bouncing ideas off one another has been, I think, a really productive process. And we're really interested to hear what you and what other practitioners and policymakers we've been talking with, how this set of metrics resonates with you. So we've had a lot of scholarly and academic input. We want to make sure we have real on-the-ground input as well before we settle in on a final set.
And what's important about the working group is thinking in these metrics is the audience. Like, who is the audience for looking at a set of community-wide metrics? So while these metrics could be helpful for those of you who administer individual programs and policies or initiatives, it's also, again, trying to take a rather holistic and robust look at the different dimensions of mobility from poverty at that community-wide scale. So the thought as the working group has been going through this process is that local philanthropy, local government officials, those of you who are leaders of different community-based organizations, chambers, that's really the primary audience. Uh, and as Marge mentioned, what was really central to the working group is in their methodology is developing the metrics in such a way that it represents all three principles. And what does the evidence say? What does the research show as it illustrates maybe one or two of the principles? So if you think about these indicators, think about it maybe as a report card, a community scale report card. And so in order to do that, the working group, as you could imagine, when you start looking through the research, there were over 100 potential metrics that could be included. But knowing this audience, it was critical that it be manageable. And so came up with 23, which I think some of you have in front of you as an attachment to some of the announcements for this webinar. There's a matrix that helps illustrate these metrics. In developing the metrics, it really came across these four boxes as again, a cohesive process, is that you have to think about mobility across the life course. As interventions and how poverty affects individuals in childhood is going to be very different than how it may affect them in adolescence or the transition to adulthood. And so we obviously have to customize and tailor the interventions to adjust to where people are in this life course. And that, again, is just another complicating factor of creating a holistic strategy for mobility against poverty. But really important that you understand that some of these metrics, based on some of the research, has happened at different stages in the life course. From there, it was critical to start translating, again, what the research into action, so domains for local action. So the working group came up with 8 domains, which in some ways help create the conditions at the local level that can support the well-being of an individual or family across these 8 domains. And as you all know, they're certainly intertwined and interconnected, but when we often talk about policy action or interventions, sometimes it's a health intervention or it's only in one of these domains. But the core here was to understand the interconnection across these 8 domains. And as we've talked with others, certainly there are probably topics which you all work in and say, oh, well, where would, for example, food security fit in? Why isn't there a domain for food security? Well, our thought, again, trying to make this more manageable, is that might be under health. Or if it was dealing with food deserts, some way to document the impact of food deserts might be in the neighborhood domain.
I'd add one other thing when you think about these domains is that if you work in one of those domains, you can probably imagine, and you may use 10s, 20s, maybe more metrics to monitor progress in your work. And we were trying to select just a handful of just a couple of really critical outcomes in each of these domains that would stand in and represent a community's progress in creating the conditions that boost mobility from poverty. So I am just preparing everybody to feel that in any one domain, we have selected just a couple of almost iconic outcomes to represent conditions in that domain, so that the emphasis is on how the set of domains work together and are all required to create conditions that support mobility from poverty.
Excellent, and that brings us now to our next poll question. What we'd like you to do is think about these domains and think about which of these policy domains does your work most engage with. And please select up to 3 of the domains. And as you're thinking about that, if you have other thoughts you want to share about the domains or how your work intersects with them, or likely intersects across several of these domains, as we know that it's very important, please feel free to add that in the chat function. And we'll keep it open maybe for another 20 seconds, 30 seconds. A lot of responses are still rolling in here. And it looks like we've leveled off. Maybe 5 more seconds. Any last stragglers? And then let's publish. Okay, great. So this is great to see. It seems like no one really stands out above the rest. Financial security is a big one, but it seems like people are touching on pretty much all of them. Home environment obviously is a big one. Neighborhood, 35%. Education, 46%. Health, 32%, and then also work, 47%. So it seems like we've got a pretty good mix here. And so now we'd like everyone to think about sort of the flip side of the question. Which of these policy domains does your work engage with the least? Feel free to select up to 3 choices. If it's only one, feel free to select only one. We just say up to 3. And again, sort of if there's other context you would like to add about how your work does or does not intersect with some of these domains, we'd love to hear that. It's very helpful for us to sort of get a better understanding of how these metrics could be potentially valuable to a range of stakeholders throughout communities throughout the country. And we'll give people, let's say, another 20 seconds or so. I think responses are still coming in. Maybe 5 more seconds for those last couple of stragglers, and then we will close and publish, all right? And interesting, okay, safety is the one that sticks out the most. And I see we've got a question coming in here about not being able to see the response boxes. I apologize if they're not showing up on your screen, but please, if you're unable to respond to the poll, please use the chat function, and you can give your responses there. You could either give the letter or the word, and it looks like we're getting some good advice there. If you click on the polls, it might help it to come up. And so yeah, just to round out my summary here, civic engagement also, I'd say a little surprising for me that 46% selected that as the least. Great, and so now let us turn it back over to you, Joe.
Well, as Marge alluded to, you then have a variety of important outcomes that are based on research and evidence that are strongly associated with future mobility. And some outcomes may be highly correlated with one another, and which outcomes are also subject to local influence. These were some of the considerations that the working group was trying to weigh as it sifted through the variety of outcomes in each of these domains. And so the group settled at this stage on 23 outcomes from across these domains, And as we've mentioned, they don't represent all of the important or relevant outcomes in each domain, but based on the existing research and literature, and then looking at this as a cross-cutting set of domains, they think, the working group thinks that this really provides a good holistic and evidence-based measurement of mobility. Yeah, Marge, do you have something you want to chime in on?
Thanks, Joe. I think I want to reinforce this notion that as you think of these, apply the screens of strong evidence to support the link to mobility from poverty, measurability, and also the potential for local action to move the needle on these outcomes, which we think then have the potential over the longer term to boost mobility from poverty.
Why don't you go ahead and walk us through the next example, Marge, because again, you're probably more familiar with some of the research and how this is just one example in the neighborhood domain of how you see the domain connected to the outcomes, connected at the bottom to the specific metrics.
Sure, thanks. And this is also a really good example about how both structural conditions in a place and the individual circumstances of residents are important measures of these intermediate term outcomes that reflect long-term mobility from poverty. So when we think about the neighborhoods within which people live, there's very strong evidence that more economically mixed and inclusive neighborhoods and more racially and ethnically mixed neighborhoods boost the residents' long-term opportunities for mobility from poverty. And similarly, it is in neighborhood where we're most likely to either experience a strong sense that we belong, that we're included, that we are valued in the community where we live, and that too, the measures of belongingness are strong predictors of mobility from poverty over the longer term. You can think about these in sort of the negative terms also. Very strong evidence that extremely high poverty neighborhoods that have experienced a lot of disinvestment, segregated neighborhoods also likely to have experienced exclusion and disinvestment, and a sense of exclusion, disrespect, not welcomeness, are all undermining people's ability and opportunities for mobility from poverty. So then the next layer in this graphic, we've really zoomed on a particular metric for each of those outcomes. Again, there are multiple metrics to choose from for any one of these outcomes, and we focused on, to the greatest extent possible, sort of proven, established metrics that have been used in the literature and shown to relate to mobility over time, but also metrics to the greatest extent possible that can be constructed for just about every place in the community, in the country. And we have some exceptions to that I'll mention. So we've used the share of people who are experiencing poverty and live in neighborhoods with very high poverty rates. We use measures of exposure of the average person in a neighborhood to people of other races and ethnicities. It's really a robust measure of the diversity of neighborhoods in which people live. And finally, because we have not had as much attention given to these issues of belongingness and inclusion, we're recommending a very short list of established questions that reflect a person's sense of belongingness and of seeing and essentially empathy, a sense of being able to see others in oneself. And those have been recommended by experts in that space as the questions we need to answer to capture this important concept of belongingness.
Thanks, Marge. As you've already alluded to, the working group has been looking and trying to make these tough decisions about a concise set of metrics is, what is, the research say that is valid and reliable? What is the data generally available? Is it available through administrative sources like the American Community Survey? Could it be supplemented locally, particularly some of the indicators that are outcomes connected to belongingness and power and autonomy? Certainly that would be an option. Have to think about geography and at what unit where local leaders can affect change, because again, as we've heard in many of the other focus groups, that those of you working in a program in a particular neighborhood, there's a different impact and a different way to measure that compared to something at the community-wide level. And of course, in order to be able to track progress over time, can this data be collected at regular intervals across these geographies? Another critical element is inclusive of key subgroups, since we know that the overall numbers that you see in some of the administrative data can mask important trends along, race, geography, ethnicity, age, and other groups. So there has to be a little bit of customization. There's some great comments in the chat room going on, and one of them was, well, what if there are some additional metrics that we would want to include or substitute? And again, the thought is that this could be customized, but it's critical that there be, in order to compare across communities, a consistent set that you would start with as the core. An important piece of feedback we've received in just about every community is that local context matters, that you have to view this data with the appropriate cultural lens. Many people have been talking about in the chat room, well, where does structural racism fit in? And again, that is in some ways sort of a cross-cutting lens that many of these metrics would need to be viewed and measured. And along those lines, again, being able to disaggregate, be able to tease out some of the important impacts that the data may not show on specific populations and geography. So a critical thing we've heard already is that local context matters.
I would also add here that the members of the working group really highlighted the importance of disaggregating any metric by geography within a community, and also by race, by ethnicity, possibly also by gender and by income level. So there's a real recognition that looking at one metric for the city as a whole or the county as a whole, it's a useful starting point. It's a way to compare to other places and say, do we have a challenge here that we need to dig into? But one number on any outcome isn't going to be the whole story for any city or county. There's a real need to dig down and look at how are patterns unequal across places within the city or county, and how do they vary across racial, ethnic, and other important demographic groups. And I think this is where attention to structural racism really comes center stage.
Great, and so we'd like to ask you all another question, and that is this cross-sectional framing of mobility from poverty a new perspective for you or your organization? So thinking about maybe some of your organizations have sort of like a working definition or perspective, or maybe it's a little more informal, but sort of is this new for the way that you or your organization would think about it? And I believe some of the advice we received before is you should be able to click on the poll if it's not working, or if that doesn't work for you, please use the chat function and you can provide responses. We can line them up after the fact, so your response will be recorded. And we'll give everybody maybe another 15 seconds to respond. Make sure it's open long enough. This is a pretty straightforward question. And so let's, all right, I think we're good. We're going to close the poll and publish the results. And about 30% of you said yes, this is a new perspective for you or your organization. 70% said no, which is great to hear. That's great feedback. And it's also in line with some of the other feedback we've received. It seems about a third of the audience this is new, and about 2/3 to 70% this is not necessarily not new, but they've encountered it before. Excellent. So now that we've provided you with a bit of an overview of the metrics, sort of how they were formed, I know there's still a lot of great questions that are floating out there about that, but we wanted to turn our attention to thinking a little bit about how the metrics could be used. And so we've come up with a couple ideas of how we think they could be used. But one of the great things about engaging such a wide group of people is that I'm sure you will come up with things that we never would have, and that will be amazingly beneficial for your community. So we wanted to throw these out there, really just to seed some ideas and get those creative juices flowing. And we want to start with this example from Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. This was a 2014 Raj Chetty study that found that Charlotte ranked last among the 50 largest U.S. cities, and Mecklenburg ranked 99 out of 100 counties in these measures of upward mobility. And basically they found, and I'm sure many people are aware in their own communities, that opportunity, access to economic opportunity, and other sort of avenues for mobility from poverty, they're often highly correlated or aligned with zip codes. And so some people are just not in areas of opportunity. And what I think is really amazing about this example, and the reason we put it up here, is that they didn't just stop there with collecting this data. They created a task force with some local leaders that developed strategies and recommendations for improving mobility from poverty in Charlotte and Mecklenburg. And that work is still going on. They've launched a number of new initiatives based on that work. And I would encourage you to check out this example, Leading on Opportunity, on their website to learn a little bit more about how they turned this research into some specific strategies. And then as another example we'd like to point you to is the Bay Area Equity Atlas. So this is an example basically of a dashboard. A lot of communities operate dashboards for a range of different things, metrics that are relevant to your community or your area of interest or work. So this one is looking at educational attainment, and it sort of highlights one of the things we think that you could do with the data that's collected through the mobility metrics, which I believe the bottom is cut off a little bit, but what these different bars are measuring are high school degree or no high school degree, associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, and what you could show, unfortunately, as I said, I think it's a little cut off, but that it's increasing, that the number of people with bachelor's, master's degrees are increasing, and the number of people who have not completed high school is decreasing. And so what this is something can show you over a 15-year period, the Bay Area has moved the needle a little bit on educational attainment. As Marge and Joe indicated earlier, though, this is sort of just your first cut. It's like a very high-level look. You would also want to look at different populations. Is it true sort of when you look across race and ethnicity or income groups? And then this example here, one of the ideas coming out of the partnership is to develop dashboards that communities could use to track some of this data. And so what we've thrown up here, this is it's called a wireframe. It's just an example of a potential dashboard. And I will point out that This is not actual data, so if we have anyone here from Los Angeles, you are not seeing decreases in access to health services. This is just some data that was put in there to illustrate how it could work. And one of the things I want to point you to is you can see this function compared to another location. This would, in theory, allow you could pull up data on your community, other communities, and then track over time. Which brings us to some of the different ways we envision that these metrics could be useful. The first is, as I've said a couple of times, to track progress. So you would be able to see progress on specific measurements, educational attainment, increases in income, wealth, whatever the metrics end up being, over a period of 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. You can then identify if there are any positive and negative trends in your community. Is your community getting better over time? Is it getting worse over time? Is it staying the same? And then probably most importantly, you can see sort of the correlation between the different metrics. Are you seeing education and health metrics increase in tandem? Are they diverging? Are you doing better among certain populations in health than other populations? You can start to see how these things flow together. And so what we'd like to throw out here is a little scenario that we cooked up. It may or may not sort of fit your specific community. But we were sort of thinking is that, so imagine you're a city council member and you work with the city council or something like that, and the budget is up for review, and you want to advocate for an increase in funding for educational services, but perhaps other people on the council question if that allocation will be helpful. So what you could do in theory is use the mobility metrics to track your city's progress over a number of years, 2, 5, 10 years, whatever makes sense, and see that maybe the city has been trending negatively in education, but then also in health and segregation. And so you could use that data to build the case that you need to increase funding in education as a way to boost not only that, but other outcomes as well. Another thing we think that you could do with these metrics is compare your community to other communities. That's a good way to help to identify if your community is actually making progress. Maybe you're going up a little bit, but other similar communities are going up a lot. Or maybe you're going up a lot and other communities are sort of staying flat. It gives you a nice sort of context for understanding changes in the data. You can then also identify where investments of time and capital are needed, and then reach out to other communities, start doing some peer learning, start seeing what your neighbors, what policies they're implementing, what programs they're doing, if they're sort of doing a little bit better, if they're pushing the needle, they're on health a little bit more than your community is, maybe there's something that can be learned, or maybe there's something that you could share about your own community's experience. And so then the scenario that we cooked up here, so imagine you're now working at the county level, and you found that historically your health outcomes are worse than the surrounding jurisdictions. And you know that health has an impact on mobility from poverty, and your county executive is therefore considering launching this initiative that would allow you to make targeted investments in health outcomes in certain neighborhoods or communities within your county. And so you will want to identify some neighborhoods that would benefit from investments, and then think about what are some appropriate strategies for those investments. But your team, you're not quite sure which sites to narrow in on. Maybe there's a couple of usual suspects that you want to pick out, but maybe you also want to broaden it a little bit. You want to add in some other communities that maybe get overlooked from time to time. So you could use your mobility metrics dashboard to assess the comparative data that's been tracked over a 2 or 5 year period, and identify specific communities that then fit your criteria and are ripe for those investments. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, with this type of data, because it does exist at a slightly higher level, is that this is an opportunity to catalyze action in your community. So you can rally local leaders in government, philanthropy, community organizations, nonprofits, business, sort of anybody in your community that is a change maker or an important stakeholder. You can coordinate efforts towards policy and programmatic change. Maybe you work in a community where there's efforts going on at the county level, but there's a number of distinct cities in that county that also have efforts, or maybe there's some regional efforts going on, and you can start to coordinate these policy and programmatic changes and other investments. You know, you'll make some investments here, I'll invest in health because that's sort of where we best align, and create really these cross-sector partnerships that are really critical for helping push the needle on mobility from poverty. And so our final scenario that we've cooked up, this is focused on homelessness. And so say your community has been experiencing an increase in the number of people who are experiencing homelessness over the last 5 years. I know this is a huge issue across a number of communities, this sort of worrying trend that homelessness is growing. And so you work for a community foundation, and you're partnering with the city manager or the chief executive and other local service providers, and you want to create a task force that's going to investigate creative strategies to better serve the needs of people who have housing instability. And you know that homelessness is not a single cause issue. There's a range of factors that go into it. I mean, sort of on a certain level, people are homeless because they lack a home, but there could be a lot of things that go into that. Maybe there's a lack of affordable housing. Maybe there's a lack of access to good jobs. Maybe they need supports like mental health supports or substance abuse treatment. And so what you do is you pull data on your city status on outcomes in all 8 domains, and you use that to rally strong cross-sector engagement to target a number of different investments to tackle the issue of homelessness. All right, so we just threw a couple ideas out there. Hopefully that generated some thoughts for you as well. And so what we would like to do now is pause and get some feedback on how you think you could use these metrics. So our question here is, what can you imagine using the mobility metrics for? And please select all of them, A through G, if that's what makes sense for you. And we'll take this question might be a little bit more involved, so we'll take a little bit longer with this one. And it seems like results are still coming in, maybe another 20 seconds. All right, and maybe last 5 seconds, click on that last one that makes sense, and then we are going to close the poll. Great. So developing policy programs and strategies, 76%, analysis and reporting. That aligns with some of the other data we've been collecting. Budget and resource allocation, priority setting, that makes sense. Case making, great. And finally, we'd like to ask you just one last question, which is to please rate how strongly you agree or disagree with this statement that the mobility metrics would be valuable to my work or my organization. So on the pretty standard 5-point scale, is this something that you would agree with or disagree with? And I think we can probably wrap this one up pretty quickly. Maybe let's give everyone 15, 20 seconds. All right, and we're going to go ahead and close it out. And that's great to see. 60% of you said agree. 29% said strongly agree. That puts us up, if my math is right, at 89%, just under 90%. It's always a little dangerous to do math on the fly like that. A couple of you indicated strongly disagree, which is really interesting to hear. And I said a couple of times for the other ones, we'd love to hear more about why that's the case. And so that's pretty much it for the webinar. We'd like to talk a couple of next steps, and then we'll open it up. I think we've only got about 5 minutes left for Q&A. There is a post-webinar survey that we will send around to everyone who registered for the webinar. This gives you the opportunity to provide a little bit more substance, a little bit more nuance to some of these questions. the webinar format, it's pretty limiting, but hopefully if you go to this link through Qualtrics, there's about 4 questions, I believe, and you can provide more detail if that's relevant. And then also on the survey, there's the option to opt in to provide even additional feedback if that makes sense for you. And then on the next slide, you have the contact information for myself and Joe Schilling. If you have any additional questions, thoughts, concerns, things like that, please feel free to send them to us. And with that, I would like to turn it over to the Q&A. And all right, let's see here. Let's see some of these questions that have come in. So there's a couple of questions.
What I would also say too, Brian, is that we see that there's a pretty robust back and forth with a number of you in the chat room. So we will also curate that in terms of feedback. And we will also, to some of the Q&A, we will also try to reach out individually after this webinar to answer some of those questions we can't get to.
Right. And I noticed there are a number of questions that came in pretty early, asking about some of the, how the metrics were developed. So things about, is there any work going on for rural areas or rural economies? Were different communities, particularly communities of color, involved in the process? Other smaller jurisdictions? And I think maybe Joe or Marge, if you want to take that question.
Well, I'll take a stab. So the development of the metrics really was driven by that group of scholars that we introduced at the beginning. But in this process of road testing that Joe described, we have really valued input from a much greater diversity of stakeholders, including people representing a lot of different kinds of communities and a lot of different kinds of interests. So I feel like we've gotten some really robust feedback that we are actually taking back to the scholars on the working group in a couple of weeks to stretch their thinking along with our own. And I think we are also really convinced and share the view that as these metrics or some version of them get applied in any particular community, urban or rural, there would be an important phase of engaging with residents to make sure the metrics make sense and they're being applied in a sensible and meaningful way.
And then we have another question here about the ideal unit of analysis for these metrics. Is it the census tract, the municipality, or the county? And I can start off, and Joe, I know you probably have some thoughts on this too, and Marge as well, but I think it's sort of a slightly higher level. Some of this data is only going to be collected, it might be at the city level or the regional level. I think the idea was not so much to go deep into sort of like individual specific numbers, but it sort of gives you a bit of a broader perspective.
Yep, the key notion here is to give city and county leaders a picture of the progress of that scale as a platform for mobility from poverty with, as we discussed, the important ability then to look at differences across places within the city or county. So that would take you down to the tract level.
Great, and then we've got another question here. Even if all of these metrics are moving in the right direction, how do you measure the number of people who have moved out of poverty? Is this just crossing the line from impoverished to not, or is this going from the bottom 10% to the top 10% of income earners? So I think sort of for this question, sort of what's the thinking, what's the context for understanding, if you're seeing a change?
So it's a really great question. And I think it ties to the partnership definition of mobility as being about more than just a few $1,000s of income or savings. So these are intended to be a set of intermediate indicators, intermediate term indicators of whether a place really has the capacity and the characteristics to boost people out of poverty in a meaningful way over the longer term. So we're not just counting success as another $1,000 of income or having just crossed over the poverty line, but this is really saying if you made headway on these in the intermediate term, the evidence suggests that you've put the people living in your community, the kids growing up in your community, you've put them on a path that boosts them toward meaningful mobility over the life course on all three of those dimensions.
Great, and so unfortunately, a lot of great questions are coming in, but we are now, I believe, a minute after 2 o'clock. So I just want to thank everyone for joining and for listening to us and providing the feedback. As Joe said, if you asked a question and we have not had a chance to answer it, we will be able to follow up. We are tracking all that, and we'll be able to follow up with you after the webinar. But then please also feel free to continue to send me your questions. You should have my email address and Joe's email address. This webinar and the slides will both be posted on the Urban website following this, probably in the next couple days. Great. Thank you all so much.
Have a good weekend, everyone.